Sometimes you look at a couple and you just think they've got it all figured out. That's how folks felt about Mark and Elena Vance. They lived in a nice little cul-de-sac in Raleigh, North Carolina. Mark was a project manager for a construction firm, always wearing a crisp shirt, always talking about blueprints and deadlines. Elena was a kindergarten teacher, the kind who baked cookies for the whole neighborhood and remembered every kid's birthday, even years later. They had the big, comfortable house with the 2-car garage, the golden retriever named Duke, and a yard that was always perfectly manicured. They had the laughs, the history. They met in college and had been married for 12 years. Everything about their life was stable, solid, and built to last, except for one thing. The one thing that felt like an invisible grinding weight pressing down on their beautiful American life. The empty nursery. They had tried everything. And I mean everything. For the first few years, it was fun, hopeful. They'd joke about baby names and paint swatches for the room upstairs. But then, as the months turned into years, the jokes stopped. The hopeful anticipation turned into frantic tracking. The romance of making a family became clinical, scheduled, and heartbreakingly expensive. They went through 4 rounds of IVF. If you've ever known anyone who's been through that, you know it's not just a medical procedure, it's an emotional war zone. Elena was a champ. She endured the shots, the hormones that made her moody and tearful, the endless waiting, the hope that soared so high it made you dizzy, and the crushing, brutal fall when the doctor delivered the news. "I'm sorry, Elena. It didn't take again." Mark watched his wife go through this, and it tore him up. But here's where the story gets tricky, because while Elena was dealing with the physical pain and the profound disappointment of her own body failing her, Mark was dealing with something else, a deep, primal fear that his legacy was ending. See, Mark came from a family where men had sons. His father, Big Jim Vance, was a man who measured success not just in dollars, but in lineage. Big Jim was always subtle, but the comments started cutting deep. "You guys going to give up on the treatment, son? Time's ticking, you know," Big Jim would say, usually over Thanksgiving dinner, while looking pointedly at Elena's empty glass of wine. Mark would defend Elena fiercely at first. "Dad, we're fine. We're happy." But the happiness felt brittle. Mark was 42. He saw his friends coaching Little League, teaching their sons how to change the oil, holding their daughters' hands at the park. He felt like he was standing on the outside of the parade, watching everyone else march by. He started to resent the situation. Oh, and then slowly, horribly, he started to resent Elena. It wasn't fair. He knew that in his head. Elena was the victim here too, but the resentment was a weed that took root in the dark corners of his heart. It whispered, "She took this from you. Your chance to be a father. Your chance to carry on the name." The doctors had been clear after the last failed attempt. Elena's body just wasn't cooperating. They suggested adoption, surrogacy, or just stopping. Elena, ever the pragmatist, said, "Mark, maybe we stop fighting the universe. Maybe we get Duke a sibling. Maybe we volunteer more." But Mark couldn't hear it. "Stop fighting, Elena? This is my life. I need to be a father." He'd exploded one night, throwing his hands up in frustration. That argument, that raw, ugly statement, was the moment the foundation of their 12 years together cracked wide open because Elena heard the unspoken truth. "You are not enough." And once that thought was out there, Mark couldn't put it back in. He started staying late at work, not because of blueprints, but because the silence of their home, the constant reminder of the failure hanging over the empty nursery, was suffocating him. That's when Chloe walked into his life. Chloe Reed wasn't anything like Elena. Elena was refined, classic, quiet elegance. Chloe was fire. She was 28, worked in the accounting department of a subcontractor firm Mark used. And she laughed loudly, the kind of laugh that made everyone in the room turn their heads. He met her during a late-night site visit downtown. It was raining, and they were the only two people left trying to hash out a budgeting issue. Mark was tired, stressed, and feeling sorry for himself. Chloe brought him a greasy takeout coffee and a smile that didn't hide anything. "Rough night, huh, boss?" she asked, leaning against the filing cabinet, her jeans covered in a light dusting of drywall dust. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not the job, Chloe. It's everything else." He didn't mean to tell her about Elena, about the treatments, about the crushing disappointment. But once he started, the words just tumbled out. He told her about the decade of struggle, the financial drain, the way he felt his time slipping away. Chloe listened intently. She didn't offer platitudes or advice. When he finished, she just said softly, "That sucks, Mark. I'm sorry you're going through that." That was the key. She didn't try to fix it. She just validated his pain. Over the next few weeks, their professional conversations bled into personal ones. They started grabbing quick lunches. Mark found himself looking forward to her texts. Chloe was easy. She didn't carry the weight of their shared history. She didn't remind him of failure. And she was clear about what she wanted. Chloe had grown up fast. She wanted stability, a family, and she wasn't afraid to say it. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, Mark drove Chloe home. They sat in his F-150 in front of her apartment complex, the rain drumming softly on the roof. "My dad always told me the greatest thing a man could do was build something that lasted," Mark confessed, staring out the windshield. "I feel like I've built a great career, a great house. But it's all temporary without a kid." Chloe turned to him, her eyes serious. "Mark, you're a good man. You'd be an amazing father. Don't let your past dictate your future." And right there, in that moment of weakness, fueled by self-pity and a desperate need for validation, Mark leaned over and kissed her. It was clumsy, hesitant, and absolutely world-shattering for him. It was a release of all the tension he'd been holding on to for years. The affair started almost immediately, and with a feverish intensity. Mark felt alive again, but it was an ugly, desperate kind of vitality. He told himself it wasn't about sex. It was about potential. It was about finding the one thing Elena couldn't give him. He developed a masterful double life. He was meticulous. He kept his phone locked, his work hours erratic, and he always came home smelling like his office cologne, not Chloe's cheap, sweet perfume. Elena, meanwhile, was trying to mend their marriage. She noticed the distance, the coldness, but she attributed it to the grief of the failed IVF. She suggested a couple's retreat, a trip to the mountains. "I just need to focus on work right now, honey," Mark would say, his stomach churning with guilt. But the guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him, because 6 months into the affair, Chloe delivered the news that Mark had secretly, selfishly been waiting for. They were having dinner at a dimly lit Italian restaurant in a part of town Mark knew Elena would never venture to. Chloe was unusually quiet, picking at her pasta. "What is it, Chloe? Something wrong with the budget reports?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She pushed her plate away and looked him straight in the eye. Her face was pale, but there was a flicker of something triumphant in her expression. "Mark," she whispered, leaning forward, "I'm pregnant, 3 months along." The world tilted. Mark's immediate reaction wasn't fear or panic. It was pure, unadulterated elation. A rush of adrenaline so strong it almost made him dizzy. "I did it. I'm going to be a father." Then the cold, hard reality slapped him across the face. "Elena." He stared at Chloe, speechless. "Are you sure? I mean, absolutely sure?" Chloe rolled her eyes. "Yes, Mark. I saw the ultrasound today. There's a tiny little heartbeat, and it's definitely yours." She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Look, I know this changes everything. I know you have a wife, a life, but I'm keeping this baby, Mark. I want you in his life." His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The moment he had dreamed of, but in the most catastrophic context imaginable. He had to choose the stable, loving, childless life with Elena, or the chaotic, uncertain, but fertile future with Chloe and his biological child. For Mark, the choice wasn't really a choice. His obsession with fatherhood had overridden his decency, his loyalty, and his love for Elena. He couldn't walk away from his son or daughter, not after everything. He took a deep breath, the smell of garlic and red wine suddenly sickening. "We'll figure this out, Chloe," he said, trying to sound like a man in control, though his hands were shaking. "I'm going to tell Elena I need to leave her." The logistics of telling Elena were a nightmare he couldn't face. He rehearsed the speech a dozen times in his truck. "It's not you, it's me. I need to be a father. I can't live with the regret." He decided he couldn't just drop the bomb about the pregnancy immediately. He had to soften the ground first. He had to create distance. For the next 2 weeks, Mark became unbearable at home. He snapped at Elena over trivial things, the way she loaded the dishwasher, the volume of the TV. He created tension where there had only been quiet companionship. He was trying to make her angry enough to push him away, to make the inevitable separation feel mutual, less like a betrayal. Elena, bless her heart, tried to hold it together. "Mark, what is going on? We need to talk. We are destroying this marriage," she pleaded one evening as he stood by the front door, keys in hand, ready to rush out to another fake work meeting. He didn't look at her. "There's nothing to talk about, Elena. I'm tired. I'm tired of this house. I'm tired of the pressure. I need space." And then one Friday evening, Mark came home earlier than usual. Elena was in the kitchen humming softly, making his favorite chili. The scent of cumin and paprika filled the air, a scent that suddenly felt like a cruel reminder of the comfort he was about to shatter. He walked into the kitchen, his heart pounding like a drum solo. He saw her smile, that gentle, worn, loving smile, and for a split second, he almost backed out. He almost threw himself at her feet and begged for forgiveness. But then he remembered the ultrasound image Chloe had sent him. A fuzzy, grainy picture of a tiny blob that represented everything he had ever wanted. He cleared his throat. "Elena, sit down." She stopped stirring the chili, her hand hovering over the pot. She saw the rigid posture of his shoulders, the flat, dead look in his eyes. Her smile vanished. "What is it, Mark? Did someone get laid off?" He didn't sit. He needed to stand to feel grounded. "No, it's about us, Elena. I can't do this anymore." She slowly set the spoon down. "Do what? The marriage? The house? What are you talking about?" "The life," he said, the words tasting like ash. "The life we have. I know we love each other, but this isn't enough for me. I need more." Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Elena was tough. "More what, Mark? A bigger house? A faster car? We can talk about that." He shook his head, looking away from her face, focusing instead on the pristine stainless steel of the refrigerator. "I need a family, Elena. A real family. And you can't give that to me." The silence in the kitchen was so profound it hurt Mark's ears. He heard the clock ticking in the living room, the low hum of the refrigerator, the ragged sound of Elena taking a sharp intake of breath. When she spoke, her voice was low, shaking, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You're blaming me, Mark, after everything we went through. The doctor said it was bad luck, that it was nobody's fault." "It doesn't matter whose fault it is," he snapped, his voice rising, desperate to end the pain quickly. It's the reality. I'm 42 years old. I'm watching my chance slip away. I need to be a father, Elena. And I found someone who can give me that. That was the bomb, the betrayal, the admission. Elena didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked at him with an expression of such cold, searing hurt that it made Mark finally look down in shame. "You cheated on me," she stated. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. "Yes," he mumbled. "But it wasn't just physical, Elena. She's pregnant. I'm going to have a child." The shock finally hit her. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Pregnant," she repeated, the word alien and sharp. "You destroyed our marriage, our life, everything we built, for a baby you haven't even met." "For my child," Mark corrected, lifting his chin, trying to sound firm. "And I had to do this, Elena. You know how much I needed this. I was dying inside." Elena finally let the tears fall, but they were silent, angry tears. "Get out," she whispered. Mark hesitated. "Elena, we need to talk about the house, the finances." "I said to get out," she repeated, louder this time, pointing towards the front door with a hand that was shaking violently. "Take your guilt. Take your legacy and get out of my house. I don't want to look at you." He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the small duffel bag he had packed and hidden in the trunk of his car weeks ago, his heart pounding a rhythm of fear and strange, selfish freedom. He walked out of the house, out of 12 years of stability, and into the rain, heading straight for Chloe's apartment. He felt like a terrible person, yes, but he also felt justified. He had secured his future. He was going to be a father. He had paid the price of his marriage, but he was getting the ultimate reward. Elena, left alone in the chili-scented kitchen, didn't move for a long time. She stood there staring at the pot of chili until it started to scorch the bottom. She didn't turn off the burner. She just stood there, the reality of Mark's brutal, calculating betrayal sinking into her soul. He hadn't just cheated. He had replaced her with a fertility vessel explicitly because she had failed him. Her love for him died right there in that moment, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just going to survive this. She was going to handle it with the same meticulous organization she used for her kindergarten lesson plans. The first thing she did once the shock wore off, and the anger was a simmering, steady heat, was call her lawyer, Rachel. Rachel was a force of nature, known for being ruthless but fair. "Rachel, it's Elena Vance. I need a divorce, expedited. Mark cheated and he's left me for the woman he got pregnant." Rachel's voice, usually booming, softened instantly. "Oh, honey, I am so sorry. Just breathe. Where is he now?" "He's gone," Elena said, her voice steady now. "He wants his legacy. I want to give him everything he deserves, Rachel, and nothing more." The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, separating assets and keeping up appearances at school. Mark was unreachable, hiding out at Chloe's small apartment, already planning the future, the gender reveal party, the baby shower, the new life. He was ecstatic, convinced he had made the right, albeit painful, choice. He had a son coming. He was sure of it. He finally called Elena, sounding stressed but excited. "Elena, I need to officially tell you about the baby. It's due in 4 months. We need to finalize the divorce quickly so I can start supporting them." Elena listened patiently, her lawyer's advice ringing in her ears. "Be calm. Let him talk. Don't show your hand." "I understand, Mark," she said, her tone neutral. "I've instructed Rachel to move quickly. I want this done." Mark sounded relieved. "Thank you, Elena. I know this is hard, but you'll be fine. You're strong." He had no idea how strong she was about to become. The pregnancy was proceeding normally for Chloe. Mark was obsessed, attending every doctor's appointment, buying every gadget. He envisioned a life of throwing baseballs, teaching responsibility, and finally earning his father's full respect. Chloe, sensing Mark's absolute devotion to the idea of fatherhood, started becoming more demanding. She insisted on a bigger apartment, a new car, and a significant financial commitment before the baby even arrived. "We need financial security, Mark. I'm going to be a full-time mom," she insisted. Mark, blinded by the promise of the child, agreed to everything. He was withdrawing huge amounts from his joint accounts, draining their savings to set up this new family unit. Rachel saw the transactions. "He's hemorrhaging money, Elena. We need to file for temporary support and an injunction against further asset movement immediately." "Wait," Elena told Rachel, a strange, calculating expression on her face. "Let him spend a little more. Let him commit fully. I want him to feel absolutely locked into this new life before we pull the rug out." "Pull the rug out?" Rachel asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. You see, Mark is obsessed with this being his child, his bloodline, his legacy. That is his entire motivation for destroying our marriage," Elena explained, her voice sharp with suppressed emotion. "I want that fact to be undeniable when the time comes." The baby was due in early January. Mark and Chloe decided they needed to be absolutely certain of the baby's health. And maybe, just maybe, satisfy Mark's deep-seated need for control. They decided on an early private DNA test right after the birth, just for their peace of mind. It was a cold, crisp morning in mid-January when Chloe gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. Mark was ecstatic. He was there for the birth, sobbing openly as he held his son for the first time. "Look at him, Chloe. He's perfect. He has my nose," Mark whispered, overwhelmed. Chloe smiled tiredly. "He's beautiful, Mark." 2 days later, following their pre-arranged plan, Mark collected the necessary samples for the private DNA test. It was just a formality, a silly little ritual for an over-anxious first-time father. He wanted to frame the results, a definitive piece of paper proving his success, his fatherhood. He dropped the kid off at the lab on his way to work that afternoon, already planning the announcement. He was going to call his father Big Jim and finally, hear the pride in his voice. The results were supposed to take 3 days. Those 3 days were the happiest of Mark's life. He was sleeping at the hospital, running errands for Chloe, talking constantly about his son, little Mark. On the 3rd day, Mark checked his email early in the morning. The subject line was generic: DNA test results, case 4598B. He clicked it open, still buzzing from the excitement of holding his newborn son just hours before. He scanned the document, looking for the bold percentage, 99.99%. But the number he saw wasn't 99.919%. The number was 0%. Mark stared at the screen, blinking rapidly, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him. He scrolled down, looking for an error, a footnote, anything that could explain the impossible result. The conclusion was stark, printed clearly under the heading Paternity Index. Exclusion. Mark Vance is excluded as the biological father of the child. He read the sentence 3 times, each reading stripping away a layer of his reality. His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible, Chloe had assured him. This baby was the entire reason he had blown up his life, betrayed his wife, and ruined his reputation. He snatched up his phone and called the lab, his voice thin and panicked. "I think there's been a mistake. Case 4598B. The results are wrong. They have to be." The lab technician was calm, professional, and utterly dismissive of his distress. "Sir, all samples are run twice for verification. The results are definitive. The tested male subject is not the biological father." Mark hung up, his mind spinning into chaos. If he wasn't the father, then who was? And why had Chloe lied? The realization crashed over him. Chloe hadn't been looking for a father. She had been looking for a provider, a stable, desperate man who would accept the child without question because he was so starved for fatherhood. He looked down at his hands, realizing the monumental, unforgivable mistake he had made. He had left the woman who loved him, the woman who had stood by him through years of pain, for a lie. He had traded his stable life for a baby that wasn't his, and a woman who was a manipulative stranger. He grabbed his keys and drove straight to the hospital, his mind a whirlwind of anger, humiliation, and terror. He burst into Chloe's recovery room. She was sitting up, scrolling through her phone, looking perfectly serene. "Mark, you're here early," she chirped. He slapped the printed DNA report down on the bedside table. The paper rattled loudly. "Explain this, Chloe," he demanded, his voice dangerously low. Chloe's face went white. She glanced quickly at the paper, her eyes widening as she saw the word exclusion. "Mark, I don't know what that is," she stammered, trying to snatch the paper away. He grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. "Don't lie to me. This baby isn't mine. Who is the father? Tell me." "It was just a mistake, Mark. Please. It was a one-time thing before we got serious." "I thought you were the father," she pleaded, tears immediately springing to her eyes, though Mark could tell they were tears of fear, not remorse. "A one-time thing? You let me destroy my marriage, move out of my home, empty my savings, all for a one-time thing?" Mark roared, ignoring the nervous nurse who peeked her head in the door. Chloe pulled her arm away, clutching the baby protectively. "We can still make this work, Mark. You love the baby. He needs a father. He needs you." "He needs his father, Chloe, whoever that poor fool is," Mark spat, the betrayal burning hotter than any passion he had ever felt for her. "I am done. You are on your own." He turned and walked out of the hospital room, leaving Chloe sobbing hysterically behind him. He didn't look back at the crib, didn't look back at the little boy he had so desperately wanted to be his son. He got back into his truck, the scent of antiseptic and newborn baby quickly replaced by the acrid smell of burnt rubber as he sped away. He was homeless, broke, divorced, and childless. He had nothing. The first person he thought of was Elena, the one person he had trusted, the one person he had destroyed. He needed her. He needed the stability, the comfort, the silent forgiveness he hoped she might still harbor. He drove straight back to the house in Raleigh, the house that was no longer his. He pulled up to the familiar cul-de-sac. The yard was still perfect. Duke, the golden retriever, was barking happily behind the fence. He walked up to the front door and knocked, his heart full of desperate, pathetic hope. Elena opened the door. She was dressed in her teaching clothes, a sensible sweater and khakis. But her eyes were different. They were cold, clear, and utterly unforgiving. "Mark," she said without surprise, "I was expecting you." "Elena, please," he began, trying to push past the shock of seeing her. "I need to talk to you. I made a terrible mistake. Chloe lied to me. The baby isn't mine." He waited for the gasp, the shock, the moment of pity. It never came. Elena just looked at him, a faint, chilling smile touching her lips. "Oh, I know, Mark," she said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "I know the baby isn't yours." Mark froze. "What? How could you possibly know?" Elena took a slow breath, the cold resolve Mark had seen in her eyes deepening into something truly dangerous. "Because, Mark, I was the one who paid for the DNA test, and I made sure I was the first one to receive the results." She didn't move, just stood there holding the line between his past life and his ruined present. "You see, I knew you would need absolute proof that your great sacrifice was a total waste. I wanted you to hit rock bottom before I finished the job." Mark stared at her, horrified. "Elena, you..." I signed the final divorce papers this morning, Mark. Rachel will be serving you shortly. And about the house, the savings, the retirement funds? Well, since you decided to abandon the marital assets to pursue a fraudulent paternity claim, the court was quite generous to me. You get your truck, and you get the debt you accrued trying to pay for Chloe's new apartment. She paused, letting the finality of her words sink in. And one more thing, Mark. You remember how you said you couldn't stay with me because I couldn't give you a child? He nodded, dread pooling in his gut. Well, she continued, her smile widening into a triumphant, heart-breaking grin. I saw my specialist last week. Turns out the doctors were wrong about me being completely infertile. I'm pregnant, Mark, 3 months along, and yes, the baby is yours. Let me tell you, if a lightning bolt had struck Mark right there on Elena's perfectly swept front porch, it wouldn't have registered. The shock of the DNA test was nothing compared to the seismic wave of Elena's final revelation. He stood there, mouth agape, staring at the woman he had dismissed as weak, as broken, as the obstacle to his future. He had called her infertile, and she was standing there glowing faintly with the secret life she carried, a secret life that was his. Pregnant, Mark finally managed, the word barely a rasp. But how? We stopped the treatments months ago. The doctor said— Elena cut him off, her voice steady and laced with the ice of ultimate victory. The doctor said it was highly unlikely, Mark. They never said impossible. Turns out once the stress of the IVF schedule, the hormones, and the crushing expectation was gone, once you were gone, my body finally relaxed. She paused, tilting her head slightly, studying his ruined face. Or maybe, she added, the smile chilling him to the bone. Maybe it was just the universe correcting a very expensive mistake. Mark's mind raced, scrambling for purchase in the wreckage. He didn't see the betrayal anymore. He saw the opportunity. He saw the child, his legacy. Elena, honey, this is incredible. He stepped forward, trying to reach for her, trying to bridge the chasm he had created. This is what we always wanted. We can fix this. We can still be a family. The moment his hand moved toward her, Elena's eyes narrowed, and she took a sharp step back, slamming the door open just enough to block his entry. No, Mark, she said, her voice dropping the honey and replacing it with pure steel. There is no we. There is only me and this baby. But it's my child, he pleaded, desperation making him sound like a whining child himself. I deserve to be there. I am the father. You forfeited that right the moment you told me I wasn't enough, Mark. You forfeited it when you abandoned your home and spent our savings on a lie, Elena reminded him, her voice a relentless prosecutor. You left me because you needed a child. Well, now I have one, and you don't get to come back just because your little plan with Chloe fell apart. He realized then that this wasn't just a divorce. It was a carefully orchestrated execution. You knew, Mark whispered, the horrible truth sinking in. You knew I was looking for the DNA results. You knew about the baby being born? Of course I knew, Elena confirmed, almost enjoying his horror. I needed to make sure your commitment to Chloe was absolute. I needed you to feel the full weight of your choices, Mark. If I had told you I was pregnant the moment you walked out, you would have just come crawling back, and you would have held this baby hostage for the rest of our lives. You would have claimed the victory. She leaned closer, her eyes glittering. I wanted you to believe you had won. You had secured your future, your legacy, only to find out that you had lost absolutely everything, including the one thing you actually managed to create. That was the moment Mark understood the true depth of her strength. Elena hadn't been grieving. She had been planning. She had turned the pain into armor, and the betrayal into strategy. You can't do this, Elena. I'll fight you. I have rights, Mark argued, his voice shaking with impotent rage. You are welcome to try, Elena replied, the sound of a horn honking down the street suddenly drawing her attention. Ah, speak of the devil. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed man in a suit carrying a thick leather briefcase stepped out. "That's Mr. Henderson, my process server," Elena informed him calmly. "He's here to serve you with the final judgment. You are legally divorced as of 9 a.m. this morning." Mark stared, paralyzed, as the man walked up the sidewalk. And Elena added, looking down at her flat stomach, which held the secret that had destroyed his life. "When this baby is born, I will of course list you as the father on the birth certificate. But if you want to be anything more than a monthly payment, you will have to prove to a judge that you are a stable, responsible man who didn't abandon his wife at her lowest point for a fraudulent affair. Good luck with that." She gave him a tiny, satisfied nod, stepped back, and closed the door firmly in his face, locking it with a sharp, metallic click. Mark stood there watching the process server approach. The man handed him the thick packet of papers, the end of his 12-year marriage, and walked back to the sedan without a word. He was officially divorced. He was officially broke. He was officially the father of a baby he couldn't touch. Mark didn't go back to Chloe's place immediately. He couldn't face her. Instead, he drove to the construction site where he used to be the project manager. It was Saturday, and the place was deserted. He sat in his truck, surrounded by the skeletal frames of buildings he had helped erect, feeling like a derelict structure himself. He opened the divorce papers. Elena and Rachel had been thorough. Every asset was meticulously detailed. Due to his abandonment and the documented evidence of him draining joint accounts to fund Chloe's lifestyle, which Rachel had clearly tracked, the judge had awarded Elena the house, 90% of the savings, and all retirement accounts. Mark was left with his F-150 and the debt from the new lease he had co-signed for Chloe's apartment, a debt he now had to cover alone. He called his father Big Jim Vance, hoping for some shred of support, some validation. "Dad, I'm divorced," Mark choked out, trying to sound strong. Big Jim's response was predictably blunt. "Yeah, I heard. Elena called me. She sounded like she finally grew a spine. What's this nonsense about some other woman and a baby that wasn't yours?" Mark explained the DNA test, the betrayal, the humiliation. He expected sympathy. "So, let me get this straight," Big Jim said slowly. "You threw away a good woman, our family house, and every penny you saved for a lie, and you came back with nothing." "But Dad, Elena is pregnant with my child. I'm finally going to be a father," Mark pleaded, clinging to the only good news. There was a long silence on the line. "Mark, you're 42 years old, son. You acted like a teenager chasing a bad idea. You don't get to destroy your home and then demand to walk back in just because the prize you threw it all away for turned out to be counterfeit. Elena is right to protect that child from your recklessness." Big Jim hung up. Mark was truly alone. He had to go back to Chloe's. He had left his few belongings there, and he needed to end this chapter completely. When he arrived, the small apartment was a disaster zone. Chloe was holding the baby, screaming into her phone at someone. She looked haggard, the triumphant glow gone, replaced by pure, exhausted panic. When she saw Mark, her tears renewed. "Mark, thank God. You can't leave us. I told my mother you were just having a bad day." He didn't raise his voice. He felt hollowed out, empty of rage, only filled with a cold, clear focus. "Chloe, I need my things, and I need to talk about the apartment lease," he stated, stepping over a pile of dirty laundry. "The lease? Mark, you can't back out. I need stability for our son," she insisted, holding the baby tighter. "He is not my son, Chloe, and we both know it," Mark said, pointing to the paperwork still sitting on her coffee table. "And since I am now penniless and have a new child on the way that I actually have to support, I can't afford this lease. You need to find the biological father and deal with this yourself." Chloe's face crumpled. "You bastard! You promised! You said you wanted a family." I wanted my family, Chloe, not yours. You used me, and I was stupid enough to let you, Mark retorted, gathering his shirts. You manipulated a desperate man's weakness. I hope you got everything you wanted out of the experience because you're not getting another dime from me. He left Chloe screaming curses and threats after him. He drove away, pulling his truck over a few miles down the road, finally breaking down. He didn't cry for Elena. He cried for the incredible, irreversible stupidity of his own actions. He had been so blind, so obsessed with a singular goal, that he had failed to see the treasure he already possessed. The next morning, Mark found a cheap, temporary rental near the outskirts of Raleigh. A sad little studio apartment that smelled faintly of mold and regret. He needed a job fast. He had been a project manager, but his reputation was suddenly toxic. Word travels fast in the tight-knit construction community in North Carolina, especially when a divorce involves a spectacular public failure. He called his old firm. His boss, a man named Arthur, who had known him for 15 years, was sympathetic, but firm. Mark, I can't keep you on right now. The clients are asking questions. The optics are terrible, Arthur explained. Take a sabbatical, clean up your mess. Maybe we can talk in 6 months. Mark was unemployed. His only focus now was the baby Elena carried. He contacted a low-cost family lawyer named Mr. Vargas, a man whose office looked as tired and desperate as Mark felt. Mr. Vargas, I need to establish paternity rights immediately, Mark explained, laying out the timeline. The affair, the divorce, Elena's pregnancy revelation, and the immediate cutoff. Vargas listened, chewing thoughtfully on the end of a cheap ballpoint pen. Mr. Vance, you have a strong case for paternity, obviously, but the custody situation is going to be brutal. She has a strong case for sole custody based on abandonment and emotional distress during the pregnancy. I just want to be involved, Mark insisted. I want to see my child. We will file for visitation and co-parenting, Vargas promised. But she has the upper hand right now, Mr. Vance. She's stable, employed, and she didn't run off with a woman who lied about carrying his child. She waited for you to crash and burn before she told you the truth. Vargas leaned forward. She didn't just want a divorce, Mr. Vance. She wanted revenge, and she executed it perfectly. The legal battle began in earnest. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about access. Elena, guided by Rachel, was a fortress. She communicated only through her lawyer, and every decision was calculated to maximize Mark's pain and minimize his involvement. She filed a restraining order, not against physical proximity, but against harassment and unexpected contact. Mark couldn't just show up at the house or the school. He started sending gifts, small, expensive baby items, hoping to show his commitment. Elena returned every single box, unopened, with a note from Rachel. All communication and financial support must be funneled through the court-mandated temporary support agreement. Mark was ordered to pay a significant amount in temporary support, calculated based on his previous income. Even though he was now unemployed, he had to liquidate the last of his meager assets just to meet the payments. 4 months passed in a haze of job applications, legal filings, and agonizing loneliness. Mark felt the cold reality of life without Elena. The constant warmth, the stability, the invisible support system she provided. He missed Duke, the dog. He missed the smell of chili in the kitchen. He missed the quiet, comfortable rhythm of a life he had deemed not enough. He found work, finally, but it was manual labor, a huge drop from his project manager status. He was working for a small framing crew, covered in sweat and sawdust, watching younger men talk about their families, feeling the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. Elena, meanwhile, was thriving. She was enjoying her pregnancy, surrounded by friends and family who rallied around her, furious at Mark's betrayal. She was the hero, the woman who endured years of medical torture only to be abandoned, and who then found her miracle. The local newspaper even ran a small anonymous story about a kindergarten teacher who found strength after a messy divorce, celebrating her resilience. Mark read it, recognizing Elena's careful framing of the narrative. She wasn't just winning the legal fight, she was winning the public perception war. One afternoon, Mark was driving past a local park when he saw Elena. She was about 6 months along now, heavily pregnant, sitting on a bench with a friend, laughing. Her belly was prominent, a beautiful, undeniable testament to the life he had created, and then abandoned. He pulled over, his heart aching. He didn't approach. He knew the restraining order was active. He was just a ghost, observing his own life. He saw her gently place a hand on her stomach, her face radiating a quiet joy that he hadn't seen since the very early days of their marriage before the IVF started to steal their light. He realized then that Elena didn't look sad or broken. She looked free. She had shed the weight of his obsession and his disappointment. The baby was hers, a symbol of her resilience, and Mark was merely the biological footnote. He went home and called Vargas. "We need to file a formal request for a paternity test right after the birth," Mark instructed. "I know it's my baby, but I need legal, undeniable proof. I need a foundation to fight from." Vargas agreed. The irony wasn't lost on Mark. He was demanding a DNA test on his legitimate child because the first fraudulent DNA test had destroyed his life. The due date was approaching. Elena's lawyer, Rachel, finally agreed to a mediated meeting. Mark walked into the sterile conference room dressed in his cheapest suit, feeling small and defeated. Elena was already there, accompanied by Rachel, her posture upright and regal, even with the weight of the pregnancy. "Mark," Elena acknowledged him with a curt nod, the first time she had spoken directly to him in months. "Elena," he replied, trying to project sincerity, "I want to apologize again for everything. I know it doesn't matter now, but I am truly sorry for the pain I caused." "Duly noted," Rachel interjected, clearly running the show. "Let's focus on the agreement." The agreement laid out Elena's terms. Mark would have supervised visitation for the first 6 months, only at a neutral location, and increasing only if he maintained consistent employment, paid all support on time, and underwent mandatory counseling focused on parental responsibility and emotional maturity. Mark was furious. "Supervised? Elena, I am the father. I am not a danger. You abandoned your family for 6 months and financially ruined yourself chasing a lie," Elena stated calmly, meeting his gaze. "A judge will see that as instability, Mark. This is the best offer you will get before we go to full trial." He looked at the woman he once loved, the mother of his child, and saw only a brilliant, relentless opponent. He signed the papers. He had no choice. A few weeks later, Elena went into labor. Mark was notified by Rachel, who gave him the hospital name and room number. He drove there, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. This was it. The real thing. He walked into the maternity wing, found the room, and knocked softly. Elena opened the door. She looked exhausted but beautiful. In her arms was a tiny, wrapped bundle. "He's here, Mark," she whispered, her voice softer than he'd heard it in nearly a year. Mark's breath hitched. He looked at the baby, a perfect, miniature version of himself. He felt a wave of love, regret, and relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. Can I hold him?" Mark asked, his voice thick with emotion. Elena hesitated, looking him over, searching his eyes. She saw the genuine anguish, the overwhelming desire for redemption. "For a minute," she conceded, holding out the baby. "His name is Henry, after your grandfather." Mark took the baby, the warmth and weight of his son settling securely in his arms. He looked down at Henry, overwhelmed. "My son, my real son." He looked up at Elena, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Elena. I know I don't deserve this, but thank you. Elena didn't return the sentiment. She just watched him, her expression guarded. We still have the paternity test to conduct tomorrow, Mark. For the record. Yes, of course, Mark agreed, nodding quickly. He knew the truth, but the court needed the proof. The next day, Mark and Elena met at the lab, accompanied by their respective lawyers, to provide the samples for Henry. The entire process was clinical, cold, and entirely focused on paper trails and legal verification. Mark dropped off his sample, feeling a sense of finality. He had lost everything, but he was finally gaining his son. He would spend the rest of his life fighting for Henry, fighting to prove he was worthy of the name father. 3 days later, Mark was back in his cramped, lonely apartment, the smell of burnt toast lingering in the air. He was preparing for his first supervised visit with Henry that afternoon. The email dropped into his inbox. The same generic subject line, the same clean white PDF. He opened the document, his heart still beating with anticipation, but without the panic of the last time. He scanned the document looking for the bold percentage, 99.99%. He found the number immediately, and he froze. The percentage was 100%, 100% match. Mark exhaled a ragged, relieved sound. He was the father. It was confirmed. He finally had the proof he needed to start fighting Elena for a normal relationship with his son. But as he scrolled down past the paternity confirmation, he saw a smaller section marked Sibling DNA Comparison. He hadn't ordered a sibling comparison. Why was this here? He read the notes. The lab, as a courtesy due to the complexity of the case, and perhaps having recognized the previous case number, had run a comparison against the other sample provided by Mark Vance months ago. The sample from case 4598B, the baby born to Chloe Reed. Mark felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He read the results of the comparison. Result: the children share 0% of paternal DNA. Confirmed exclusion. Of course, Mark thought. Chloe's baby wasn't mine. Henry is. But then he scrolled down to the very last line of the comprehensive report. It was a note flagged in red, added by the geneticist. Genetic note: Case 4598B versus Henry Vance. While the tested male subject, Mark Vance, is excluded as the father of Case 4598B, the children show a high degree of maternal DNA sharing, 99.99%. Mark read the sentence 3 times. Maternal DNA sharing. The baby Chloe carried and the baby Elena carried shared the same mother. Mark stared at the monitor, his blood turning to ice. This wasn't possible. Chloe had given birth in January. Elena had gotten pregnant in October. He reread the analysis, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped his cheap coffee mug. The children show a high degree of maternal DNA sharing. This meant that Chloe and Elena were genetically linked. They were sisters? No, that wasn't right. Elena had no siblings. She was an only child. Then the horrifying, impossible explanation slammed into his brain with the force of a wrecking ball. Chloe and Elena weren't sisters. They were the same person. Wait, no. That couldn't be right. They looked nothing alike. Elena was quiet, refined. Chloe was fire, loud, and 8 years younger. He stared at the screen, running through the possibilities. If they shared maternal DNA, they were either twins, or the babies were the result of the same biological mother. He thought back to the IVF process, the hormones, the eggs. A memory flashed. Elena's eggs had been harvested during the second round of IVF years ago. They had frozen the viable ones, hoping for a successful transfer later. They had paid thousands for storage. Mark snatched up his phone and called Rachel, ignoring the protocol. He didn't care about the divorce anymore. Rachel, I have the DNA results. I need to know something about Elena's IVF records. Did she donate eggs? Did she sell any? Rachel's voice was sharp. Mark, you know that information is confidential. What is this about? Just tell me, did Elena ever sell or donate her eggs? Rachel sighed, annoyance warring with professional caution. No, Mark, she never sold them. But she did agree to a very unusual contract several years ago. After the second failed cycle, you remember the clinic needed a control group for a new hormone study. They offered a huge discount on the final cycle if she agreed to donate half of her remaining frozen eggs to their research program. It was anonymous, non-contact, for research purposes only. And what did they do with those eggs, Rachel? Mark demanded, his voice cracking. They fertilized them anonymously and used them in a donor program for women who couldn't produce their own eggs, Rachel explained slowly. It was all legal, Mark. Why? Mark hung up the phone, the world spinning. Chloe Reed wasn't the mother of the baby she carried. Chloe was the surrogate who had carried Elena's biological child. Chloe had signed a contract years ago to be a surrogate for an anonymous donor program. She had received a fertilized egg, an egg created with Elena's genetics and an anonymous sperm donor. But wait. Chloe had told him the baby was his. She had lied about the paternity, knowing he was desperate. Mark pulled up Chloe's photo on his phone, then looked at Elena's photo. Elena, the refined kindergarten teacher. Chloe, the fiery accountant. He realized the horror. Chloe hadn't been looking for a father. She had been looking for a provider for the child she was carrying. A child that was biologically Elena's, but not his. Chloe had found the desperate, obsessed Mark Vance, and she had used his own wife's genetics against him. But that still didn't explain the 100% paternal match on Henry. The baby Elena carried was his. Mark felt a sudden, terrifying suspicion. He went back to the original IVF notes he had saved years ago. The frozen eggs were Elena's. The frozen sperm was Mark's. When Elena had donated half her eggs to research, she had also agreed to donate half of Mark's frozen sperm sample, which was stored alongside the eggs to be used anonymously in the research program. The child Chloe carried, the child Mark had destroyed his life for, was biologically half Elena's and half an anonymous donor's. And the child Elena carried, Henry, was entirely theirs. But why did Chloe lie and say the baby was Mark's? Mark sat back, running a hand over his face. He remembered the details of the affair, the timeline. Chloe hadn't conceived the baby with Mark. She had conceived it through the donor program. But when she found out she was pregnant with Mark's wife's egg and knew Mark was obsessed with fatherhood, she saw her chance. She targeted Mark, knowing his vulnerability. She used her pregnancy with Elena's biological child to lure Mark away, promising him the family he craved. And Elena the genius must have found out about the connection. She must have seen Mark's betrayal and realized the ultimate, sick irony. The woman he left her for was carrying a child that was biologically Elena's. Elena hadn't just gotten pregnant on her own. She had been given the ultimate weapon. She allowed Mark to destroy his life for a lie, knowing that the woman who helped him commit the betrayal was carrying her biological child. Elena had engineered Mark's complete, spectacular downfall using her own fertility and Mark's desperate need as the levers. Mark looked at the final report again, 100% paternal match for Henry Vance. He was the father of Henry. He was the father of the child he had abandoned the mother of. He had sacrificed his stable, loving marriage for a surrogate carrying his wife's egg. And in doing so, he had activated Elena's ultimate revenge, the one that left him penniless, alone, and fighting for the scraps of a life he had been too blind to appreciate. He had to call Elena. He had to know how deep this went. He picked up the phone. his finger hovering over the number he hadn't dialed in months. He needed to understand the scope of her cold, terrifying genius. He had wanted a legacy. Elena had given him a masterclass in consequence. He stood there in his tiny, smelly apartment, the DNA report glowing on his screen, the truth so twisted and elaborate it felt like something out of a bad movie. Elena hadn't just gotten pregnant on her own. She had orchestrated the entire thing. She had watched him throw away his life for a woman carrying her biological child. It was the ultimate cold-blooded trap. He didn't care about the restraining order. He didn't care about Rachel, and he certainly didn't care about protocol. He grabbed his phone and dialed Elena's number, his hand shaking so hard he almost dropped the device. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was calm, clear, and totally devoid of surprise. "Hello, Mark," she said. It sounded like she was waiting for him. "You knew," he choked out, the accusation thick with disbelief and rage. "You knew about Chloe. You knew that baby wasn't mine, but you let me walk away. You let me destroy everything." Elena sighed, a sound of weary patience, like a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. "Of course I knew, Mark. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the woman you threw 12 years of marriage away for? Especially when she suddenly appeared pregnant right after our final failed IVF attempt." "But the maternal DNA match," Mark stammered, pulling the pieces together. "The eggs, Chloe was carrying your egg. It was fertilized with an anonymous donor's sperm." "Very good, Mark. You finally read the fine print," Elena replied, the satisfaction evident in her tone. "Yes, Chloe was a surrogate for the research program I donated 2 years ago. They transfer the embryo anonymously. Chloe was just a vessel, Mark, carrying an embryo that was genetically half mine. And you used that?" he whispered, horrified by her precision. "You used your own biology to set me up." "You set yourself up, Mark," Elena corrected, her voice hardening. "I simply provided the landscape. You were obsessed with fatherhood, with legacy. That obsession made you blind. When you walked out and told me I was not enough, I realized I had to let you have what you thought you wanted. I had to let you commit completely to the lie." "But why? Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant sooner?" "Because if I had told you the moment you walked out, you would have come back instantly, claiming your rightful place as the hero," Elena explained, her logic chillingly clear. "You would have forced me through a pregnancy filled with your anxiety, your guilt, and your constant presence. You would have taken ownership of Henry before he was even born. You would have claimed the victory you didn't earn." She paused, letting the silence drive the point home. "I needed you to be completely isolated. I needed you to be financially reckless and legally indefensible. I needed you to hit rock bottom with Chloe, believing you had secured your future, only to find out it was a complete and utter waste. I needed the court to see that you abandoned your home and your wife for a fraudulent claim. That, Mark, is what gives me sole custody. That is what protects Henry from your instability." The sheer scope of her planning, the patience, the cold calculation, left Mark breathless. He had dismissed her as emotional, as weak, as the victim. He had been so terribly wrong. "You are punishing me," he said finally, the rage draining away, leaving only defeat. "No," Elena countered flatly. "I am protecting my son. And yes, Mark, I am also enjoying the consequences of your actions. You wanted a legacy? You got one. You are the father of 2 biological children who share a mother, but you have access to neither of them." He heard the faint cry of Henry in the background. It was a sound of life, of hope, and it was utterly out of his reach. "I will fight you for Henry," Mark vowed, clutching the phone. "I expect nothing less," Elena said, the challenge clear in her voice. "But you should know, Mark. Rachel has already filed for a psychological evaluation based on your impulsive and financially devastating decisions over the last 9 months. Good luck explaining that to the judge from your new job stacking lumber." She hung up. The dial tone buzzed loudly in the small studio apartment, echoing the emptiness of his life. The next few weeks were a brutal, grinding reality. Mark was now officially the father of Henry Vance, but the court treated him like a dangerous stranger. His lawyer, Mr. Vargas, was fighting a losing battle against Rachel's meticulous documentation. Mark's job on the framing crew was physically exhausting. He worked 10-hour days in the North Carolina heat, his hands calloused and raw, his suit-wearing past feeling like a distant, ridiculous dream. Every paycheck went straight to support payments, leaving him with barely enough for rent and gas. His supervised visits with Henry were the only things keeping him tethered to reality. They took place every Saturday morning at a sterile, brightly lit visitation center downtown. A social worker sat just 3 feet away, meticulously documenting every interaction. The first time he held Henry at the center, Mark tried to connect, tried to be the doting father he had fantasized about for years. "Hey, buddy," Mark whispered, adjusting the soft blanket. "I'm your dad. I promise I'm going to make this right." The social worker scribbled something on her notepad. The visits were agonizingly short, just an hour and a half. Mark spent the time walking the baby, singing terrible off-key lullabies and trying to memorize the exact shade of Henry's eyes. He felt a profound, aching love for his son, but it was a love steeped in failure and regret. Elena never came to the exchange. Henry was dropped off and picked up by a friend or a family member, a deliberate barrier designed to prevent any spontaneous contact or emotional appeal. The psychological evaluation that Elena had requested was humiliating. Mark had to sit in a therapist's office and explain in painful detail why he had abandoned his life for a woman who was carrying his wife's biological child. "I was desperate, doctor," Mark confessed, leaning forward. "I felt like my time was running out. I thought Elena had failed me, and then Chloe offered me a way out, a chance to be a father without the pain of the past. And when you discovered the paternity was false, what was your immediate reaction?" the therapist asked, her pen hovering over her pad. "Rage, humiliation, and then desperation to get back to Elena," Mark admitted. "I realized I had destroyed the one good thing in my life for a phantom." "So, your primary motivation for seeking custody of Henry now is to reclaim the life you lost, not necessarily to provide stability for the child." The question was a punch to the gut. Mark knew the answer he should give, but the truth was messy. "I love my son, doctor. I want to be his father. But yes, I also want to rebuild what I broke." The therapist's report, when it reached the court, was damning. It didn't call him dangerous, but it characterized him as emotionally immature, impulsive, and prone to poor judgment driven by an overriding personal agenda. This report, combined with the clear evidence of abandonment and financial recklessness, Rachel had submitted bank statements showing thousands of dollars spent on Chloe's apartment and car before the divorce was finalized, gave Elena an almost ironclad case for sole legal and physical custody. Meanwhile, Mark was still dealing with the fallout from the Chloe situation. She hadn't disappeared. She was still living in the new apartment Mark had co-signed the lease for, and she was refusing to move out or pay rent. He called her, trying to appeal to her basic decency, which he knew was a fool's errand. "Chloe, I can't afford this anymore. I have court-mandated support for Henry. You need to find a way to pay the rent or move out, or you'll ruin my credit." Chloe screeched over the phone. "You promised me stability, Mark! You promised this was our family! You owe me for wasting my time!" "You lied to me about the paternity of the baby," Mark roared. "The baby still needs stability, and you're the only one on the lease," Chloe retorted, triumphant. Mark was now legally and financially bound to support 2 women and 2 children, one biological son he barely saw, and one biological son of his wife carried by his mistress, whom he was still paying rent for. It was a perfect hell. He went to Mr. Vargas. "We have to break that lease. I'm drowning." Vargas shook his head. "Chloe has leverage, Mark. We can fight it, but it will cost more in legal fees than the remaining rent. Mark was trapped. He was paying for Elena's revenge and Chloe's manipulation simultaneously. His one last hope was his father, Big Jim. Mark drove the 2 hours to his parents' farm outside of Asheville, a place he hadn't visited since before the divorce. Big Jim was fixing a fence post, sweat staining his familiar plaid shirt. He didn't look up when Mark pulled his dusty F-150 into the driveway. "Took you long enough," Big Jim grunted, driving a post deeper into the clay soil. "Dad, I need help," Mark pleaded, standing awkwardly by the truck. "I'm broke. I can't keep up with the support payments and the debt. I'm going to lose my job if I keep taking time off for court." Big Jim finally stopped, leaning on the fence post, his eyes hard and unwavering. "I hear you're paying rent for the woman who lied to you. That true?" "Yes, Dad. She trapped me." "You walked right into the cage, Mark. No one forced you," Big Jim said dismissively. "You came here looking for a bailout. I won't do it." "But Henry, your grandson, I need to be a part of his life." Big Jim's expression softened slightly, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I know, and I see him, Mark. Elena brings him over once a month. She's not preventing us from seeing him. She's just preventing you." Mark was stunned. "Elena brings Henry here, but she won't even talk to me." "She's protecting the boy, Mark, and frankly, I don't blame her," Big Jim stated, picking up his hammer again. "She knows Henry needs a family history. She's making sure the Vance name is known to him, even if the father is a fool. She's a good woman, Mark. A damn good woman. The best thing you ever had, and you pissed it away chasing a ghost." Big Jim delivered the final blow. "You wanted my respect? You earn it back by handling your own mess. You pay your debts. You fight for your son legally on the merits without running home to Mommy and Daddy for cash." He turned back to the fence. Mark was dismissed. He drove back to Raleigh, the silence in the truck heavier than ever. He was truly alone. Elena had not only defeated him, she had turned his own family against him. The custody hearing was scheduled for the end of the month. Mark knew the cards were stacked against him. He was facing a judge who had read a report detailing his abandonment, his financial ruin, and his emotional instability. Mr. Vargas was blunt. "We will lose primary custody, Mark. We need to focus on securing meaningful visitation rights and avoiding having the visits monitored indefinitely." "What about the fact that Elena used the IVF and the surrogacy to set me up? That's manipulation," Mark argued desperately. Vargas shook his head. "It's brilliant strategy, Mark. It doesn't legally invalidate her fitness as a mother. It just shows she was intelligent enough to protect her assets and her child from an unstable spouse. The court won't see her as manipulative. They'll see her as resourceful." Mark realized the terrifying truth. Elena hadn't broken any laws. She had simply used the rules of the marital contract and the legal system to their absolute maximum potential. The night before the custody hearing, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat in his tiny apartment, looking at the faded picture of Elena and him on their honeymoon. 12 years younger, ridiculously happy. He had been given everything, and he had thrown it away for an idea that turned out to be biologically his wife's setup. He realized his entire argument had been built on a foundation of self-pity and entitlement. He had never truly apologized for the damage. He had only apologized for getting caught and for the plan failing. The morning of the hearing, Mark walked into the courthouse feeling like a condemned man. Elena was there, dressed professionally, looking serene and strong. She held Rachel's arm, but her gaze never wavered when she looked at Mark. The hearing was brief and brutal. Rachel presented the case with surgical precision. Mark's history of prioritizing his legacy over his wife's health, the abandonment, the draining of joint assets, the psychological report, and the current financial entanglement with Chloe. When it was Mark's turn, Mr. Vargas tried to humanize him, focusing on his love for Henry and his current stable, though low-paying, employment. But the judge, a stern woman in her late 50s, was unimpressed. "Mr. Vance," the judge stated, looking over the documents, "you made a series of profoundly reckless decisions rooted in self-interest. You prioritized an unverified paternity claim over your marital responsibilities, resulting in significant emotional and financial distress for the plaintiff." The judgment was swift. Elena was awarded sole legal and physical custody of Henry. Mark was granted supervised visitation for the foreseeable future, with the possibility of unsupervised visits reviewed in 1 year, contingent upon stable employment and continued therapy. He was ordered to maintain the current support payments, and cruelly, the judge made a note about the shared debt with Chloe, instructing Mark to work that out privately and responsibly. Mark had lost completely. He walked out of the courtroom a divorced, broken, marginalized father. He stood on the courthouse steps, watching Elena walk out with Rachel, their heads together, already discussing the next steps for Henry's education funds. He knew he couldn't just accept this. He had to show Elena he was still fighting, not for himself, but for Henry. He went home and called Vargas. "We need to file an appeal. I need to get Henry out of supervised visits." "Mark, we just lost," Vargas sighed. "I know, but I have to prove to Elena that I'm not going anywhere. I have to prove I've changed." Mark started working double shifts, saving every penny. He paid off the debt he owed his parents from an old college loan just to show Big Jim he was serious. He was meticulous about his therapy sessions. He was rebuilding his life, piece by painful piece, not for Elena, but for the hope of Henry. 6 months crawled by. Mark was still on the framing crew, but he had secured a promotion to foreman, a small step back toward management. He was stable. He was paying the bills. He was still seeing Henry under supervision, enduring the stifling presence of the social worker. One Saturday, during a supervised visit, Mark was bouncing Henry on his knee, making him giggle. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, smiled faintly, the first genuine positive reaction he had received. "He's a beautiful baby, Mr. Vance," she noted. "He is," Mark agreed, looking at his son. "He's everything I ever wanted." Later that day, Mark received a surprising text message. It wasn't from Rachel, it was from Elena. "We need to talk. Not lawyers, just us. Meet me at the park where we used to walk Duke. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Mark stared at the text. It was the first direct contact she had initiated in over a year. He knew it was dangerous. It was likely another trap. But the chance to talk to her outside the sterile confines of the court was too much to resist. He showed up at the park the next morning, heart pounding. Elena was already there, sitting on a bench near the oak tree where they used to tie Duke's leash. She wasn't pregnant anymore, and she looked strong and healthy. "Thank you for coming, Mark," she said as he approached. "Why the meeting, Elena? Is this about the appeal? Because I'm filing it next week." Elena shook her head. "No, it's about Henry. And it's about seeing if you've actually changed or if you're just playing a role for the court." She looked him over, noting his work boots, his worn jeans, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "You look different," she observed. "You look tired, but you don't look desperate." "I am tired," Mark admitted. "I lost everything, Elena, everything I built. I realize now that the biggest mistake wasn't sleeping with Chloe. It was leaving you because I blamed you for our bad luck. I was cruel, and I was wrong." It was the first truly honest and comprehensive apology he had ever given, without the caveat of the failed DNA test or the blame on Chloe. Elena nodded slowly. "I appreciate the honesty, Mark, but apologies don't fix years of pain. They don't change the fact that you abandoned Henry before he was even conceived." "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to be a real father to Henry. I will continue the supervised visits. I will continue therapy, but I need a goal, Elena. I need to know that one day I can tuck my son into bed." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note. "I spoke with Mrs. Patterson yesterday," Elena said. "She noted that your engagement with Henry has been consistent and appropriate. She recommended lifting the supervision requirement for short, public visits." Mark felt a surge of hope. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm willing to try," Elena interrupted. "But not because the court is forcing me, because I'm deciding that Henry deserves a stable father, if one is available. And I'm starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the man who destroyed my life is finally gone, replaced by the man who is willing to work for his son." She handed him the note. It was a schedule. "This is the new visitation schedule. Unsupervised visits, 2 hours every Sunday afternoon at a neutral public location. You take him to the zoo, the park, the library. You don't bring him to your apartment. You don't try to pump him for information about my life. You just be his father." Mark stared at the paper, tears blurring the ink. It was a lifeline. "Thank you, Elena. I won't let you down." "If you let me down, Mark," Elena warned, her eyes turning cold again, "I will not hesitate to put Henry back into supervised visits and fight you for the rest of his childhood. Do you understand?" "I understand," he affirmed, clutching the schedule. "Good. Now there is one last thing," Elena said, standing up. "It's about Chloe." Mark winced. "I'm still dealing with that lease. I'm going to have to file bankruptcy to get out of it." "No, you won't," Elena said, a faint, almost secret smile touching her lips. "You see, after the divorce, I was awarded the majority of our liquid assets. I used a portion of those funds to purchase the mortgage note on Chloe's apartment building." Mark stared at her, dumbfounded. You bought her building?" "Not the whole building, just her unit's mortgage note, through an LLC. I also happen to own the debt on the car lease you co-signed for her," Elena explained, her voice low and utterly triumphant. "I waited until the rent and the car payments were 6 weeks late. Then yesterday, I initiated foreclosure proceedings and repossession." Mark could only gape. She hadn't just defeated Chloe. She had taken control of her entire financial existence. "She's evicted, Mark, and the car is gone. Your debt to her is now debt to me. But since you are now paying appropriate support for Henry, I'm willing to call that debt settled. You are free of Chloe Reed, Mark, completely." She had cleaned up his mess, not out of love, but out of necessity, to ensure the father of her child was not financially dragged down by a manipulative surrogate. Elena looked down at him, the victorious architect of his ruin and his fragile redemption. "You wanted to know how deep this went, Mark. It went deep enough to ensure that every single consequence of your betrayal was paid in full, and that your path forward is entirely controlled by me. Now go be a father." She turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing alone in the park, holding the schedule that represented his meager second chance, knowing that the woman he had underestimated was the most formidable force he would ever encounter. He had spent years fighting for a legacy. He was now fighting for the right to hold his son's hand, a right entirely dependent on the grace of the woman he betrayed. The game was over. Elena had won, and Mark's long road to redemption was just beginning. The silence after Elena hung up was heavier than any construction material Mark had ever lifted. He stood in his cramped kitchen, holding the schedule that represented his meager, fragile future. He didn't file the appeal. He didn't call Vargas. He knew deep in his gut that fighting Elena was not only futile but counterproductive. She had given him a thread of hope, and he dared not snap it. The very next Sunday, Mark showed up at the designated park precisely 5 minutes before the scheduled time. Elena was there, sitting in her SUV, Henry secured in his car seat. The exchange was strictly businesslike. Elena spoke only to give instructions. "He's had his bottle. He needs his diaper changed in an hour. Be back at exactly 4:15 p.m. Mark nodded, taking Henry's carrier. The feeling of holding his son alone, without the cold, watchful eyes of a social worker, was intoxicating. It was real. He spent those 2 hours walking Henry around the Raleigh Rose Garden, talking nonsense, pressing the baby's tiny hand against his rough cheek. For those 120 minutes, Mark was simply a father, unburdened by debt, divorce, or deceit. When he returned Henry precisely at 4:15 p.m., Elena simply checked the diaper bag, looked at her watch, and drove away. No praise, no forgiveness, just compliance. This became Mark's life. The Monday through Friday grind was about earning money to satisfy the support payments and the residual debt that Elena now controlled. The weekend was about Henry, He held on to his job at the framing crew for 6 more months, working harder than anyone else. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave. He took night classes in project management software, determined to prove that his instability was a temporary condition, not a permanent character flaw. Meanwhile, the Chloe situation evaporated exactly as Elena had promised. Chloe, facing eviction and the repossession of the car, had no stable provider left. Mark learned through a quick final text from Chloe, full of bitterness and blame, that she was leaving Raleigh to move in with a distant relative in Florida. The baby Mark knew would be raised by Chloe and whoever she managed to manipulate next, but he was finally free of the financial and emotional entanglement. Elena had surgically removed the infection. A year after the divorce, Mark finally got a break. He was hired as a junior project manager at a small regional firm, a huge step down from his previous status, but a step back onto the career ladder. He got a raise, moved into a slightly better, though still modest, apartment, and most importantly, he showed the court and Elena that he was stable. At the 1-year review, Mark, Elena, and their lawyers met again. Rachel presented a file detailing Mark's consistent payments, his clean record, and the positive reports from his therapist. Elena, looking at Mark across the table, finally offered a small olive branch. "I agree to move to extended unsupervised visitation," she stated, her voice formal. 4 hours every Sunday and 1 weeknight dinner, provided he remains current on all obligations. Mark wanted to shout with relief, but he simply nodded. "Thank you, Elena, I accept." He knew this wasn't kindness. It was pragmatism. Elena was recognizing that a stable father was beneficial to Henry. Mark had earned his right to a slightly larger scrap of his son's life. The next few years were a testament to the quiet, grinding work of rebuilding character. Mark never remarried, never even dated seriously. He couldn't risk it. The shadow of Elena's control, the knowledge that any mistake meant losing Henry, was a constant, powerful deterrent. He learned to love his new, simpler life. He realized that the stress and pressure of the perfect life he had ruined, the big house, the expectations, the constant competition with Big Jim's legacy, had been toxic. Now, his success was measured only in Henry's happy smile. Let's jump forward 5 years. It's a bright, warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. Mark is sitting on a metal bleacher at a little league field in North Raleigh. Henry, now 6 years old, is playing t-ball, wearing a helmet that looks slightly too big for his head, and chasing butterflies in the outfield. Mark looks exactly like the kind of dad you see everywhere. Faded jeans, a baseball cap, a slight paunch he's trying to work off. He's happy. Genuinely, quietly happy. He's no longer just the Sunday dad. He sees Henry every Wednesday night for dinner, and they spend 6 hours together every Saturday. Mark helps him with his homework, teaches him how to toss a ball, badly, since Mark was never a sports guy, and reads him stories. He is not, however, watching the game alone. Across the diamond, sitting on a blanket, is Elena. She looks fantastic. She's still the refined, elegant Elena, but there's a new ease to her. She's talking quietly to a man Mark recognizes as Julian, a history teacher at Henry's elementary school. Julian is solid, kind, and utterly non-threatening. He looks like he bakes sourdough and knows how to use a library card. He is the antithesis of Mark's ambition and chaos. Elena and Julian are clearly a couple. They are stable, calm, and devoted to Henry. Mark watches them, and for the first time in 6 years, he feels no jealousy, only a quiet acceptance. Elena needed stability, and she found it. She needed a partner who didn't measure his worth by his lineage, and Julian fit the bill. Their co-parenting relationship is a masterpiece of professional distance. They communicate exclusively through a shared co-parenting app, schedules, medical appointments, school notes. They exchange Henry at the school parking lot, a neutral public zone. They never speak about their past, their personal lives, or their feelings. Today is an exception. Henry hits a ball, a lucky weak tap, and bolts toward first base, his helmet wobbling. Both Mark and Elena jump up simultaneously, cheering. Henry looks over and grins, waving at both of them. As Henry rounds the bases, Elena walks over to Mark's bleacher, holding 2 plastic cups of lemonade. "He's getting better," Elena notes, handing Mark a cup. "He practices hard," Mark replies, taking a slow sip. The lemonade is perfectly balanced, not too sweet. It tastes like Elena. They stand in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their son. "I got the final paperwork on the old house last month," Elena says quietly. "The mortgage is paid off. I'm starting a new foundation, a scholarship for children whose parents struggle with infertility." Mark nods. The house, the debt, the shame, all liquidated into a legacy of Elena's own making. That's a good idea, Elena." "It is," she agrees. She looks at Mark, her eyes clear and unreadable. "You've been consistent, Mark. You haven't missed a payment. You haven't missed a visit. You've earned Henry's trust." "I'm trying," Mark says simply. "I'll keep trying." Elena turns back to the field, her expression softening as Henry crosses home plate. "I still hate you for what you did, Mark," she says, her voice low, meant only for him. "But I don't regret what came after. You forced me to be stronger than I ever thought possible. You forced me to protect Henry completely." She takes a breath. "And you got what you wanted, Mark. You got your son. You just had to lose everything else to realize that Henry was worth more than the legacy you were chasing." She sets her empty cup down. "I'll see you at the exchange on Wednesday." And with that, she walks back toward Julian, who smiles kindly at Mark before putting his arm around Elena. Mark watches them go, the afternoon sun warm on his face. He is standing on the outside of the parade again. Yes, but this time he's not watching everyone else march by. He's watching his son, the one he fought for, the one he sacrificed everything to keep, even if his role is permanently limited. He finally understands the difference between the legacy he craved and the fatherhood he earned. The legacy was a hollow ambition fueled by pride. The fatherhood was the sweat on his brow, the small apartment, the consistent presence, and the humbling acceptance that he was the secondary parent in his son's life. And deservedly so. He pulls his cap lower, grabs his glove, and walks toward the dugout to congratulate Henry. The story of Mark Vance isn't one of grand reconciliation or forgiveness. It's the story of a man who was so obsessed with the idea of having it all that he threw away the real thing, only to discover that the price of his greatest desire was the total spectacular collapse of his entire world. Elena Vance, the kindergarten teacher, didn't just survive the betrayal, she weaponized it, using Mark's own desperate need for a child to ensure his total defeat and her absolute control over their son's future. She won the house, the money, the stability, and the high ground. She built a new life, stronger and more resilient than the one Mark had destroyed. Mark got his son, Henry, but he forever lives on Elena's terms, a permanent reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you dismissed as weak. And sometimes, folks, the most complete victory isn't the one celebrated with cheers, but the one executed with quiet, cold precision. Mark learned that lesson the hardest way possible, by losing everything he thought he needed to gain the only thing that truly mattered. And that right there is where Mark Vance's long, long road finally settled into a quiet, hard-earned peace. The moral of the story: true legacy is not found in the preservation of a name or the passing of a bloodline, but in the character one maintains when no one is watching. Mark Vance learned that when we treat the people we love as obstacles to our desires, we don't just lose them. We lose the version of ourselves that was worthy of being a father or a husband. Obsession makes us blind to the treasures we already possess. By the time we open our eyes, we may find that while we have secured the prize, we have forfeited the right to hold it with a clean heart. In the end, a man's worth isn't measured by the children he creates, but by the integrity he shows in protecting the family he already has.